think of space, and many of us instinctively feel small, not just when faced with the science, but also the sheer scale of the cosmos. 2 trillion galaxies, 400 billion stars. Numbers so vast, they stop being numbers, and they turn into something closer to poetry. Gently guiding us through all this is a scientist who believes in bringing a keen sense of childlike wonder to all that vastness. Because wonder, as it turns out, might be the most important quality we have. It is the engine behind curiosity, behind discovery, behind our very human need to ask what is out there and whether anything out there is asking the same question back. To explore that idea and much else besides, I'm speaking to Professor Brian Cox, particle physicist, broadcaster, musician, and most recently, a UN champion of space. A professor at the University of Manchester, he has worked on some of the largest particle physics experiments ever conducted. He has also, in a previous life, played keyboards in a rock band. For years, he's come to us via a variety of screens, asking audiences to look up, take in the wonder of it all while contemplating questions that may never be fully answered. And now, as part of the Emergence tour, he comes to us live from arenas across the universe. I'm Rohit Brijnath, senior columnist. Welcome to In Your Opinion, a podcast by the Straits Times. Joining me today is Professor Brian Cox. Brian, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure.
So, Brian, if I can call you that, you have such a powerful sense of wonder. And I think you always manage to infect people with it. And I think you definitely infected me with it. So I want to know where this sense of wonder comes from.
As far back as I can remember, I was interested in astronomy. And I don't know where that interest came from. But I loved looking at the night sky. I was fortunate that for some reason I connected that with physics as a discipline, which meant that when I went to school, when in the UK, when you're 11, you go to school and you can do physics as a subject for the first time, and I knew that by, I suppose, learning more about that science, I could understand better what I was seeing in the night sky. I think Carl Sagan actually is one of my heroes, who I also grew up watching in the late 70s and early 80s in the UK. He once said that the more you learn about those things, when you know that those points of light in the sky are other stars, and then in the 1990s and onwards, we've learned that all of them, pretty much to a good approximation, have planets around them. So at every point of light you're looking at in the sky is a host to a solar system. And then you start wondering about the worlds orbiting around there. One of the things I say in the live show is that we estimate maybe 1 in 20 stars, roughly, may have a rocky planet orbiting in the habitable zone around the star, which makes it a potential home for life, I suppose, optimistically speaking. So then you start to say, well, those stars you're seeing in the night sky are other worlds. There's something about knowing more about nature, and the more you learn, the more fascinating it becomes. And so that's, I think, where my sense of wonder comes from. It's one idea, really, that the more you know about something, and it could be the evolutionary history of a blade of grass, or it could be the details of the points of light in the sky, the more you know, the more wonderful it becomes.
So one of the things is that, I think, especially when I look at social media, which I shouldn't, is that, there's this great certainty in this world. Everybody's so certain about everything. But, wonder involves curiosity, right? Do you wish sometimes that people were more curious than they are?
It's a very good question. And it goes to the heart of one of the threads through the live show, is exactly what you said. So I phrased it slightly differently, which is, if you are sure you know everything, if you are certain, you have closed off the possibility of progress. But progress, if you think about it, by definition, requires you to notice that there's new knowledge to be gained. Otherwise, there's no progress. And actually, The show starts with a story about Johannes Kepler in around 1610, walking across the Charles Bridge in a New Year's snowstorm and thinking about the structure of snowflakes. And he wrote a beautiful book, which is still in print, and I strongly recommend it, called The Six-Cornered Snowflake, in which he just asked this question: so why have they all got six corners? And many historians cite that time in that region as the beginning of modern science, because people like Kepler, Galileo, and others start asking questions about the patterns they see in nature, most famously the motion of the planets. But also in Kepler's book, you see this question about the structure of snowflakes. And one of the most important things at that time is Kepler says at the end of the book, I don't know. I don't know the answer to this question. And that's radical because historically speaking, people tended to assume that everything was known by Aristotle and Plato and the Greeks, so maybe if there's something we didn't know, we'd forgotten it. And there was this authority in the past. Whereas for some reason, and historians debate this a great deal, right? But for multiple reasons around that time, people start, the notion of new knowledge, of things yet to be discovered, comes into the culture at the time. And really, if you think about progress, so there's another book I would recommend by a historian called David Wooten, which is called The Invention of Science. I think it's called that, or The Invention of Modern Science. And in that book, he points out that if you'd taken someone from, I don't know, Greece, ancient Greece, Rome, Egypt, even ancient Egypt, 3000 BC, and put them in Europe in 1500, there wouldn't be much different. Now, the architecture would be different, of course, but there wouldn't be technology really, bits of things, but not much. But if you take someone from 1600 in Europe and put them in 1800, they would have been in the Industrial Revolution. They would have had no idea what was happening. So what changed around that time? And I think most historians would agree, one of the things is this notion, as you said, that there is new knowledge to be gained, there is progress to be made, and that requires you to understand that there are things you do not know. And of course, I suppose the sense of your question is, you can extend that. We're talking about science here, but it does apply actually in all fields of human endeavor.
Absolutely, yeah. But what I'm wondering is, I don't know what they teach in schools these days in science or anything like that. Can you teach or inculcate a sense of wonder in kids? Is that something that schools should be looking at, I wonder?
I think this will almost sound like a cliched answer, but I think it's true. I think the sense of wonder is there. And it's often described, right? Scientists are often described as people who've not lost their childlike sense of wonder. I think it's true, actually. So I think really the question is, how do we not destroy it? How do we not constrain it? Because I think it's innate and it's there. And it's a very good question. It's not a simple answer, of course. It's very easy to sit here and say we do things wrong in schools, but of course there are technical aspects to education. There are things, if you're going to be a professional scientist, and of course not everybody is, but if you are, there are things you need to know. You need to learn how to do mathematics. If you want to be a social scientist or whatever, you need to understand how to read and interpret literature and so on. So I think it's not trivial. And we have to be careful not to fall into the trap of saying, well, obviously we're doing something wrong in schools. It's hard to figure out how to maintain this sense of wonder. But I do think, just very briefly, I have thought, so I lecture at the University of Manchester, and I still do that. I enjoy it. I lecture first years. I have it was kind of lighthearted initially, but I now believe it. I think we should abolish examinations in the first year at university. Now, I understand that sounds naive, and there'll be people watching who say, what are you talking about? But it's just, I would like the students to ask a literally existential question, which is, why am I here? Right? Why am I here? I am not here to pass exams. Right? I really want them to know that. And I understand there's a value in examinations. I understand all that. But I would love those people to come at 18 years old, and sit in the university and say, well, if I'm not here to just get grades, what am I here to do? So, of course, it's to learn.
But it's really interesting you say that, because when I wrote my last column on you, when you came in 2019, I said, this is the questions that, Brian Cox makes us ask, why are we here and where are we going? And I thought that's what your show does. So I love alien movies. This is just one of my things. I love alien films, like so many of us or whatever. And I know you've spoken about life, does life exist? I just wanted to know two things. Are you surprised we have not detected life elsewhere? And do we have the tools to do it?
This is a very deep question. And I also address this in the live show, actually. It's part of the second act of the show. So I think, so there's a question, the origin of life. How likely is it that carbon chemistry will get sufficiently complex that we call it biochemistry on a world where the conditions are right? So we are exploring that, of course, on Mars, Jupiter's icy moons and elsewhere, particularly on Mars. And I think that the recent results from Mars are showing us that carbon chemistry did get complicated on Mars. Now, we do not know whether it got complex enough to be called life, but there's a recent result from the Curiosity rover science team, actually, and also results from the Perseverance rover, which are suggesting that at least the building blocks of life were present on Mars 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. So we think everything you need was there. Now, the last step is the big step, which is, did those ingredients make the transition to something we would call biochemistry? And of course, we don't know, but I think many people are, let's say, optimistic. I think the more we learn about Mars, the more we think there is at least a chance. But of course, you've got to see it, because we're talking about science, right? My guess would be that if you forced me to guess, I would say we will find evidence of life of some description beyond Earth in the solar system, never mind further out. And also, by the way, I should say that new instruments like the James Webb Space Telescope are allowing us to investigate the atmospheres of exoplanets, planets around distant stars, in increasing detail. So it may be that we find the telltale fingerprints of life in the atmosphere of a planet orbiting a distant star. We're on the edge of being able to do that now. So I wouldn't be surprised at all. But there are two questions here. There's a different question, which is complex life and intelligence. Now, we have searched a bit, right? So SETI is a systematic survey of the sky, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, primarily using radio telescopes, but looking for other signatures too of civilizations. And we haven't heard anything at all. Now, it is true to say that we haven't surveyed all of it by any sense, right? There's a lot of space. Increasingly sensitive instruments allow us to look deeper and deeper out into the galaxy, because we're primarily talking about the Milky Way galaxy in this sense. And we've heard nothing. My guess would be that microbes are common, complex life is rare. And I'll give you one just very brief reason why I think that. It's the history of life on Earth, which is an observation. So the only example we have, of course, of a living world is Earth. And as far the evidence here tells us that life began pretty much as soon as it could on the Earth, maybe 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. But it didn't get complex until the last billion years, by which I mean more complex than a single cell. And the civilization, of course, a civilization has only existed for a few, 10,000 years, let's say 20,000 years. So on Earth, 4 billion years roughly from cell to civilization. That's a long time. If that's typical, that would be my guess as to why we don't see evidence of many civilizations out there. So it's a long answer, right, to a simple question, but it's a very good question. That's my guess. Okay. I just want to say one last thing. It goes back to the previous thing you said about this, that we don't know. being important to say, that the foundation of progress, we don't know. So I could very well be completely wrong about what I've just said. It is a guess. It could be that there are no microbes in the solar system beyond Earth. And it could be there are no microbes for thousands or millions of light years in every direction, right? Or it could be that we see evidence of another civilization tomorrow. So but given what we know, I had a guess, but I might be wrong.
Yep. So I wonder, this is a small question, but I wonder, when you're up there on the stage and you're talking about stars and galaxies, how do you see yourself? I mean, do you see yourself as a teacher, a guide, an explorer, a traveler, a student? How do you see yourself? And obviously it'll be maybe a mix of one or two things. How do you see yourself?
That is the most wonderful question. Because I haven't really thought about it. How do I see myself when I'm on stage? So I'm trying to explain things. And obviously we've, a narrative. There's a narrative to the show that I've developed over many months and years, actually. So there's an arc to the show. There's a point to the things I'm saying. But the reason I think it's such a wonderful question is you said they're student, I think, or someone as well. And so I do, when I'm talking about these ideas, there's always, by the way, a temptation to get overly into detail. So because I want to explain things. And so I'm on stage and sometimes I have to rein it in and say, I'm not going to go into too much depth here. We're going to be here all night, right, if I'm not careful. But what happens then, which goes to the heart of your question, is I will realize I don't have what's the simplest way I can explain this? And then you realize, and I do sometimes, that I don't understand it myself in sufficient detail. And it will sometimes occur to me on the stage. I say, actually, the reason I stumbled over this explanation is because there's something there that I don't understand. And actually, it happened quite recently. I'm always changing the show a bit. So there's an arc there and there are big graphical sequences. But I find sometimes some new images or some new discovery will appear and I'll read about it and get excited and say, can I weave that in? And I change the way that I talk about the formation of galaxies in the early universe. There's an idea called the cosmic web, which is this structure which we think really, not initially, but forms early on out of dark matter. And then the galaxies form around it. And there's a beautiful simulation we use that was provided to us by some groups in Japan, actually, that we show the supercomputers of the galaxies forming. And I realized that I didn't know what the input to those simulations was. When I was on stage talking about it, and I thought, there's a thing called the cosmic microwave background radiation, which is the oldest light in the universe, and there are patterns in that, which we understand as sound waves moving through the young universe, and it's very beautiful. But we understand also, we have a theory of the origin of those sound waves and what they were like, and it's a theory called inflation. We can talk about all these things. But all that was going through my head, and I thought, I don't actually know what they used as input to this simulation. And the reason I didn't know, I tried to say it, and then I thought, I don't actually know. And so then I went away and educated, and it was a wonderful thing, and I loved it. I spent a couple of hours figuring out what was actually what was the input to this. So that I love it when that happens, because even though it might be in front of 10,000 people on stage, you go, this is one. That moment where you go, I don't understand something is a wonderful feeling, even if it's in front of 10,000 people, because then there's something to go and discover. Yeah. There's something new to go and find out.
Yeah. So, but I guess that's a nice thing, because I feel that there's something profound when knowledge is humbling, and this, as you say, there's no finish line, we keep going. But, I saw this video clip of you having a conversation with David Attenborough about Charles Darwin.
Yeah.
And, I sort of found a little similarity between you and Attenborough, because I feel, I find him to be an evangelist for the living world and creatures, and I find you to be an evangelist for, this whole sense of space and the adventures out there. So it struck me when you were talking, and you were talking about Darwin, and it's just a fun thing. So I was wondering if you could have a hypothetical roundtable discussion with any three humans in history, say Galileo, for instance, who would you invite and what might you ask?
Oh, it's a wonderful question. I would like Johannes Kepler there, because
Okay.
he's in my mind, because my live show starts with him. And the more I find out about him and the more I read, and in particular, this lovely book, as I mentioned, The Six-Cornered Snowflake, which you can get on Kindle, right? You still get it. It's there, and you can read it. And you see this mind that's and he's not. He doesn't. Of course, he doesn't know everything. This is a mind from 1600. So it's a mind at the beginning of what we, as I said before, well, of course there are scientific, I don't mean to say all science began there. Of course I don't. But there's a change there. And so you see this mind grappling with these ideas. And he gets many things wrong. He didn't believe in atoms. There's a wonderful quote in the book, actually, because from ancient Greece, there's Epicurus, I can't pronounce it, who's the one of the people of the atomic, that people thought about atoms, and obviously Democritus and people like that were thinking about atoms. But he says, there's a line in the book where he says, well, it can't be these atoms because that really is nothing. And he talks about a snowflake as an almost nothing. So this wonderful thing, this almost nothing, what is the structure of it? And then he makes these little jokes like, it's not atoms because they really are nothing. I don't believe in that nonsense. So there's something, but also he, the laws of planetary motion, it's quite astonishing to me that from the data that they had, and this was data from, I always mispronounce his name. I think the correct pronunciation is Tycho Brahe, right? Tycho Brahe, whatever, however you pronounce it in Danish, I think it's Tycho Brahe. So it's 1570s, 1580s, this precise data about the orbit of Mars, for example. And I say orbit, he didn't know that. He just, the position of Mars against the stars. And then Kepler, from that data, derives, I don't know, it's derived. He sees the laws of planetary motion. Planets move in elliptical orbits around the sun, sweep out equal areas in equal times, and all this stuff we can prove from Newton's law of universal gravitation, which is 1687. So now we teach it, we go backwards from Newton, but he got this from this data. You think about that. You've got measurements of a point of light moving around in the sky against the fixed stars. That's it. And you see this pattern and you get the right answer. So I'd love to talk to him. That's radical at the time. And also he spoke to Galileo. He knew Galileo, they corresponded, so maybe I'd have Galileo there as well, because I'd like to ask Galileo about this.
Of course.
So it's because I really do get the sense that they were inventing a new way of looking at the world at the time, and it's the foundation from which everything else followed.
Okay, third person.
So I've got Kepler and Galileo. I'm trying not to be predictable because I really would love to I'd love to speak to Einstein. I would have loved to do it.
Oh, yeah, that makes,
And it's not just because he's probably the most famous scientist of all time, but it is the case that you got through the history of physics. We're talking about, again, 1905 is a great year, special relativity, the photoelectric effect, which is one of the early papers in what became quantum mechanics. So he's got this, that's what he got the Nobel Prize for, actually, not for relativity. So again, it's someone who's looking at nature, experimental results, and making radical and beautiful leaps. And so I think I'm interested in these people who are on the cusp of something, so it's not just incremental progress in understanding. It's just this leap. I should say I've had the two physicists from my field, I had the real great pleasure to meet, where one is Hans Bethe, who's one of the great physicists who worked on the early, many things actually, but particularly understanding stars, right? The nuclear physics of stars. Remember that this is it's not until the mid 1930s that we haven't discovered the neutron until 1932. So you have and then people begin to understand how stars work. Well, he was central to that, amongst many other things. And I got to meet him for an afternoon in Manchester. He gave a lecture, and he was in his 90s at the time. But he was a bridge back to Einstein and to the greats. So he'd lived through that whole of 20th century physics and played a key role. So that was one person who I did meet. And the other was Stephen Hawking, who I got to meet several times, actually. Yeah. And again, Hawking, everyone knows him maybe now for his popular Brief History of Time and so on. But the work he did in the study of black holes and general relativity in which is Einstein's theory of gravity in the early 70s was absolutely foundational, and is it's one of the pillars of modern research. From that, a lot of the questions about quantum information that are now relevant in quantum computing and so on, a lot of it goes back to the work he did in the early 70s. So I did get to meet two of these people who I would perhaps have said I would have liked them around the table.
So, I think you inspire a lot of people. And, so when they meet you and, say in the aisle of a supermarket or whatever, what is the thing that people are most likely to say to you? Is it like for me, one of the things, if I met you in a supermarket, I'd be talking about the scale of things, which you talk about, like 2 trillion galaxies and 400 billion stars. So what do people talk to you about? What is it? What grabs them?
The most likely question is, can I have a selfie? But putting that one aside.
Yeah.
I think people do. Yeah, it's the scale, but also one of the common questions is, what is the universe expanding into? So I get asked that quite a lot, because people know the universe is expanding. And then, the picture that I think many of us would have in our minds, therefore, is something, it has to expand into something. But the answer is that we don't know if the universe is infinite or not. So we don't know whether it's finite or infinite. And space, but the distance between objects, galaxies, increases. So you have this picture, I suppose, in Einstein's theory, space stretching, but it could be infinite and still stretching. And that confuses everybody, and it's not a very good answer, but it is the answer that we have, right? So we don't know. And also, what happened before the Big Bang? And again, the answer is we don't know. Part of the reason is we don't understand what time is at a fundamental level. And so, questions of before, that presumes that time predates the Big Bang, right? If you say what happened before the Big Bang, you're saying time was there. And we don't think that's the case, right? But then we don't even know if the universe had an origin in time. If there's a moment and time begins at that moment, we don't really understand that. There's actually, just to say, going back to what I mentioned about Stephen Hawking and his early work on black holes, that's led, I think, or played a big role in a field called emergent space-time, which is interesting today, which is saying that space-time is not fundamental, but comes from something else, emerges from something, some network of qubits or whatever it is. So all the great questions that people tend to ask in the supermarket have a 3-word answer, which is we don't know, which is a bit disappointing, but that's what physics is.
Yeah, true. So you are a UN champion of space, am I correct?
Yes, that's a post that I...
Yeah, so I know you've been asked this before, but I want to ask again. Would you like to go into space?
I would. And actually, just a few weeks ago, as we record this podcast, so we're recording in May 26, I should say, in case anyone's watching it in the future. We're just about 3 or 4 weeks ago, the Artemis 2 mission went around the back of the moon. And the photographs, it was Earthsat, actually, I think, the photograph, rather than the famous Apollo 8 Earthrise photograph from 1968, was just stunning. You look at those photographs, and I think I would love to see that. It was they're all the most powerful photographs, I think, that we as human beings have taken. So the most powerful image we have seen with our own eyes. And I would love to see that. So I think the answer is I'd love to go around the back of the moon like Apollo 8 did on my first Christmas Eve, actually, on the Earth in 1968,
Okay. Oh,
and
yeah.
see an
Yeah,
Earth
yeah.
rise or an Earth set over the surface of the moon. I would love to see that. I'd like to be away for about a week, which is which is the caveat. So I don't mind.
Okay.
I wouldn't mind going around the moon. I'd quite like to land on the moon. Maybe give me 2 weeks so I can pop down and come back again.
Okay.
Mars, no. I do not want to spend months or years in space, but I'd love to have a little trip to see the Earth as the whole Earth from space.
So I read this, a wonderful book the other day. Actually, my mother gave it to me, called Orbital by Samantha Harvey. I don't know if you've come across it. So it's basically about astronauts inside a space station as it's slapping the planet, and what they see and what they feel. Now, astronauts, as you know, they're often transformed by what they see, like Scott Carpenter, And are
Yes.
you unsurprised by that, by the fact that they are transformed by what they see?
Unsurprised. I don't think so. I think they were surprised. So I think because particularly you talk about Scott Carpenter and many others, who've spoken about this. Jim Lovell comes to mind, but virtually every astronaut you talk to says these things. And I think most of them at the time, they were test pilots, right? They were flying these things that I'm not sure they thought of them as anything other than new aircraft to test, initially. But you're right that they were transformed by the experience. So I suppose it feels obvious to us now, knowing what we know, that if you go high above the Earth and look back at it, you get there's some sense of I don't know, the value and power and fragility. I think Scott Carpenter spoke about that of the Earth, and I think it took them by surprise. So I think it is surprising. The David Attenborough, to go back to, you mentioned Sir David. He said famously that the Apollo 8 Earthrise image from Christmas Eve 1968 is the most important environmental image ever taken, because of the reaction it got, because people saw the Earth from space. They hadn't seen it like that in 1968. Those images are more commonplace now, but it made a big impact. So I think that it's what, you probably know, I may have, last time we spoke, maybe I said it, but I've always argued that all leaders of countries should actually be required in the future to go up into space and then come back again. It should be a requirement when you take office, just so you can see the thing that you're responsible for. And I think that actually, I said it as a joke once, but I think the more I think about it, the more I think it makes sense.
Absolutely. It makes a lot of sense to me. I saw you once on I think it was a Stephen Colbert show, and you were talking about a small picture of a nighttime sky taken by the James Webb Telescope, right? You know which one I'm talking about. That piece of sky that contains 10,000 galaxies. So I found it obviously very profound, but I wondered, I know you have many answers to this, but give me one. So I found it profound and astounded by it. What do you find miraculous?
I mean, part of it, as you said, is the scale, which is, I agree, impossible to internalize or picture. When you see, there's an image in the show, in the current live show, from the Vera Rubin Observatory, which is a new observatory, and there are 10 million galaxies in the photograph. And what does it mean, 10 million galaxies? A galaxy is hundreds of billions of stars. It takes light maybe 100,000 years to cross a large galaxy, at least 100,000 years at the speed of light to cross it. And there are 10 million of them in the photograph, and 2 trillion by some estimates in the observable universe. It's impossible to imagine. So there is that component of it. But the more deeply I think about it, the more I think the most astounding thing is that anything exists at all. Which might sound rather philosophical. But if you go back to basics, this universe exists, and the laws of nature that we discover, and the fundamental building blocks of nature that we have discovered, allow such complexity to exist. And it's not only these huge galaxies, these islands of billions of suns, but it's, of course, structures like us. Right? We're products of the same laws and the same building blocks. And I think that is a genuinely profound question. You should be astonished. I'm astonished when I think about it. I think we just ignore it, don't we? We say, well,
Yes,
of course,
we do.
stuff
Absolutely.
exists at this level of complexity. But why, even given the laws of nature and the building blocks that we have discovered and understand, it is still the case that 13.8 billion years ago, the universe was just filled with hydrogen and helium primarily. So the simplest two chemical elements. And then and dark matter, which we don't know what it is actually, but it's dark matter, it's some kind of particle. And then gravity clumps things together. And 13.8 billion years later, we're having a conversation about it.
Yep.
Carl Sagan said it beautifully. He said, a physicist is a hydrogen atom's way of learning about hydrogen atoms. Which is, so it's the existence of physicists. Let's put it that way. That's an astonishing thing.
Yeah. So, I have myself always enjoyed, this, the sense of mystery about, things, But there's also a part of me that wishes some mysteries would never be answered, that they would just remain mysteries, because there's something profound in that as well. So I wonder, are there any mysteries that you think should never be answered?
I don't think we're ever going to have to face that dilemma.
Okay.
To quote again, I keep quoting people, but Carl Sagan, I remember, said somewhere something wonderful is waiting to be known. That was a quote. And I think that's it. If you think about it, even if we had this theory of everything, whatever that means, right? So some kind of complete understanding of the laws of nature and the building block. Even if we had all that, we talked about 2 trillion galaxies. So what's happening in one of those? That might be, what kind of planets are there? What kind of life might there be there? You can't derive that.
No.
So there's absolutely no chance of the mysteries disappearing. And of course, I should say, this idea of a theory of everything, we don't know whether there is such a thing, we don't know whether there's only one way the universe could possibly be, and it's the only logically consistent way we do. Not all that stuff. We're just beginning to take our first steps in this direction. But even if we have it all, even if we have the whole fundamental thing worked out, can you imagine that's not the end of it, is it? It's not the end of the mystery. So I don't think there's any possibility that we're going to run out of things to discover.
So, if I decide I'm going to buy a telescope, if I look at the night sky, what should I look at?
Oh, the first most stunning thing, the easiest thing with the telescope, even in a city, is to look at the planets. Any telescope will show you the rings of Saturn. And obviously, the more powerful or the darker the sky, the better the atmosphere, the more detail you can see in the rings. I have a telescope myself, a small telescope, and I can see the Cassini division, which was first seen by Cassini, of course, back in the division in the rings. So you see more detail. That Saturn is, I think, pretty much everyone that I have shown that to. So everyone who's looked through the telescope I have and seen Saturn for the first time becomes emotional about it, because it looks like a child's drawing of a planet. And it's impossible. So you go from the telescope, you look through the eyepiece, and then you look at this little point of light, this little yellowy point in the sky with your eyes. And then you go back to the eyepiece and you go, it can't be this. I can't be looking at that. It's this thing. It's these huge rings, this beautiful planet. So Saturn, Jupiter, you'll see the cloud tops of Jupiter. You will also see the Galilean satellites, these 4 moons that Galileo discovered in 1610, which was central actually to the development of our modern civilization, because they were one of the key pieces of evidence that told us that everything doesn't go around the Earth. Galileo said this, it's obvious they're going around that planet. So you can sit there and watch them. And actually Io, the innermost one, you could pretty much see move over the course of an evening if you catch it in the right place, because it goes around so quickly. Then you have this observation with your own eyes that was of immense historical importance. So yeah, the planets, but then you can start, if you've got darker sky, even a small telescope or binoculars, actually, you'll see the Andromeda galaxy. That really, to see that, it depends. It's not really the telescope again or the binoculars. It's just the darkness of the sky, and you'll see Andromeda, and you can say that thing is quite big on the sky. It's dim, this misty patch, but it's big, and it's over 2 million light years away. So I say to people sometimes, think about that. It means the light that's entering your eye now began its journey long before we had evolved as a species.
I love that. I love that idea.
It's beautiful.
Yeah,
but there's something about, you say it and you can see a photograph of it, but there's something totally different when you see it with your own eyes. So those are the things. The planets are easy. The nearby galaxies, particularly Andromeda, are easy. Things like the Pleiades star cluster, beautiful, this stellar nursery. It's beautiful through a small telescope.
Okay, now you're giving me something that I need to do. But of course, can't do it in Singapore because there's too much light reflected back up, I think.
Well, planets, though. You'd be all right with the planets.
I'll be okay with the planets.
That's the thing. That's the beauty of the planets. You'd see them, maybe not right in the middle of Singapore. But just you can. You can see them with the naked eye in the city. Jupiter, you'll see, right?
Okay.
So you can see it. So through a telescope, you'll see it.
All right. Okay. So this is. There are always things that frustrate scientists, and often it is to do with the conversations out there. What drives you nuts? What are the things that people say that drive you nuts?
That I could. There are two answers to this. If you let me just be too overly verbose, right? I'll try to be quick. The correct answer, definitely, intellectually, is one that Carl Sagan gave again. Another book I would recommend is The Demon Haunted World, Carl Sagan's magnificent book from the 1990s, Science as a Candle in the Dark. In there, he tells a story about a taxi driver in New York, and he got into the car, and he was a famous astronomer on television, and the taxi driver started asking him about aliens and flying saucers and Atlantis and all this kind of stuff. And Sagan very wisely said that this is not a person to be laughed at or ridiculed. It's a person who is curious, has a mind, is interested in things, but has not. It's almost a person who has been failed by the education system. Ultimately, it's failed by society, because there are wonderful things. There are strange objects, black holes, where Einstein says the end of time lies inside these things, and also whatever it is, the 2 trillion galaxies we talked about, questions about life on Mars, all these things, and yet popular culture is delivering these things that, yes, they're nonsense, but they're not really interesting. It's not interesting. Atlantis or whatever, that's not interesting. It's just so. Sagan, that's the correct answer, is you should never say, I'm really frustrated, this annoys me. The people who think the Earth is flat or we didn't land on the moon or something, and be annoyed by it is the wrong response. Sagan's right. You should be, I will try to show you the true wonder. It's better than this. We're better. There are more interesting things. But of course, I'm also a human being from the from the north of England, whatever, and I grew up, and I've got so it is. It is frustrating and astonishingly. Conspiracy theories are endlessly frustrating, of course. But if you try to engage with them, I guess you get more frustrated and so on. So people say ridiculous things, and of course, I think that's ridiculous. What do you do? But intellectually, Sagan is correct that you don't ridicule people. You don't, just say dismiss. You try to engage. You should. We have to do that, but it is difficult.
Yeah, last year I'd gone to Augusta in Georgia in America, and early in the morning somebody was driving me back to Atlanta, and the moon was up, and I said, it was early in the morning, and I said, look at it, isn't it beautiful, and isn't it amazing that human beings walked on it? And he said, no, and then he gave me a lecture for 25 minutes of how it was false and the moon landings were staged, and I just didn't have the heart to sort of say anything to him. But it's amazing that people still think those things.
Well, yeah, but as Sagan said, it's a failure. Ultimately, it's our failure.
True. It is
it's not
failure.
their. I think that's the right way to look at it. It's not their failure; it's our failure to explain what wonderful things we as scientists. Yeah, but but the thing is, the last thing I would say is that there's also a serious side to that, of course, because it's, who cares if someone doesn't believe we land on the moon? But you kind of do care, because it means you don't trust the government. So it means you don't trust society. So you think there's someone who's hiding things from you. And so it can become a very dangerous mindset, because we start to distrust the structure, the very structure of our society we start to question. So it is a problem.
Okay, so I have just two music questions. Okay, so though, of course, you say that one of the, this is not a question, this is just something that intrigued me, that with one of your bands you broke up with after a disagreement in a bar, which made me think, was Professor Brian Cox brawling in a bar? But was it a brawl? No, it's just a disagreement.
Actually, sort of. It actually wasn't me that was doing the brawling.
Oh,
but there was a brawl.
Oh, there was a brawl, okay.
Yeah. I think the only reason it wasn't me is because I think I'd gone to bed. So it was after I went to bed that they were there. So yeah, but I probably would have been involved had I been there, if I had not gone to bed early.
Okay.
But this was the early 90s in Berlin, I think it was. So it was a rock band.
Exactly, that's what rock musicians do. Okay, so actually the two questions I have is, one, what was your musical highlight? And this could be partly getting your undergraduate degree signed by the Bee Gees, but what was your musical highlight?
It's true.
I love that story.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. It was actually the syllabus for the exams at Manchester University, and I was on top of the pops at the same time, so I got the Bee Gees to sign it, and it's one of my most treasured possessions. Right? But I think there was so many at the time, because I was 18 or 19, and so I loved playing live, and we were a rock band, and we liked playing live. And the first big shows we did, and they weren't that big in hindsight, but they felt big to us, was supporting Jimmy Page. So we got to support Jimmy Page. It was a tour he did called the Outrider Tour. And so being on stage, being the opening act for Jimmy Page, and then being able to see him play, he didn't play a lot of Led Zeppelin songs, but he did do Stairway to Heaven at the end, and it was just to see him on that double neck guitar in person playing, and having been a small part of that show was wonderful. And then we did some bigger shows with the band Europe, which is a different kind of band, right? But they did a huge tour that we did with them, 3 months or so in Europe, big venues, 10,000 seats plus. And some of those shows were just wonderful, because when you get it right with an audience of 10,000 people, it's just playing music. It's a feeling that you can't replicate. So those are many of the highlights. One of them, by the way, was recently, because I haven't quite I haven't really stopped playing music. I play a lot. And in the live show, this new live show, there's a song at the start of the second act, and it's a celebration of the Voyager spacecraft. So the Voyager spacecraft, still in contact with them, we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the launch next year. 1977, these things were launched. We're still talking to them in interstellar space. And so there's an artist, PJ Harvey, who many of your listeners will know, is a wonderful musician. And she'd come to one of my shows a few years ago, and I'd been in contact. And I said, is there any chance you want to do something? Would you like to try and write a song in celebration of Voyager? And she said, yes. And so I collaborated with her on this song, which and we recorded it a couple of months ago, actually, just back in February in a studio. And so I played on it, and I was in the studio, and I remembered all those things that I loved. It's kind of 40 years ago now, or whatever it is, 35 years ago that I last did that. And I remembered how much I love it and how much I love collaborating with musicians. And just to say, actually, the music, there's also music, a different kind of music from Dario Marianelli, who also worked on the show. He's an Oscar-winning movie composer. And he wrote the music at the end, and we recorded that with an orchestra. And I love that as well, which I was never into 35 years ago. So just being with musicians and collaborating and bringing out these ideas, a different way of looking at things, I love that. And so I'm still doing it, actually.
You play the keyboards?
Yeah, I played on the PJ Harvey song, which is going to be released as a single, I think, in
nice.
the next couple of weeks as we speak. So everyone will get to hear it, and you get to hear it if you come to the show. But it's a celebration of Voyager. It's actually, I just say very briefly, the idea, she sent me a lot of demos that she had, some ideas. And one of them was a little sequence, and it sounded to me like a message, almost like Morse code in the music. And so I'd said to her, what if it's Voyager? The song is Voyager after 50 years in space, looking back at Earth and telling us what it's learned. It goes back to the previous question about seeing, because famously, Voyager 1 took the pale blue dot image, the famous image Carl Sagan wrote about of Earth from, I think it's 4 billion kilometers away, if I remember. Just this dot, this pixel. And so it was that idea. And she delivered these wonderful lyrics, which is the spacecraft saying, this is reflecting on Earth from interstellar space. And so it's a lovely thing.
So actually this, when I told a friend of mine that he came with me actually to the show in Singapore last time around in 2019, and I told him that I'm going to be chatting with you, and of course he was very envious. So he said, I have a question. I said, okay, send it across. Yeah. So he said, ask him, is there any similarity between music and physics, or are they completely different languages?
They're different languages that are, I think, at their heart asking the same question, or attempting to answer the same question. Because in a philosophical sense, right? So it's obviously physics is some asking how things work at some level, so how does it, is there a law of nature that tells you the planet's going elliptical orbits, as we spoke about earlier? So that's physics. But also it raises these deep questions about our place in the universe. You can't help but avoid these questions when you think about what we have learned. So I count that as the domain of physics and cosmology as well. There's a word that I heard recently. It's cosmologia. So there's cosmology, which is just the data, the modeling, the science. And then there's cosmologia, which is the philosophical questions, or the deep questions that arise from that data. And they're different things, but they're linked. But then if you think about that, then music is ultimately about the same thing sometimes. So one of an example would be on the Horizon show that you saw morphed into a performance with an orchestra. So we did it, for example, it was probably my favourite thing that I've done in recent years was at the Sydney Opera House with the Sydney Symphony. And we took that show, cut it down, distilled the ideas, and set it against primarily Strauss's Zarathustra. So Richard Strauss's Zarathustra is based on Nietzsche's book. And Richard Strauss said, I think it was at the premiere, he said, how can we justify our existence when faced with the unlimited power of nature? This music is about that. Now you can't, it's a different language to express those same things. That music is this question. And it's an eloquent and beautiful answer to the question. Actually, ultimately, Strauss leaves it unresolved, by the way, at the end. It's this wonderful sort of clashing of different keys musically, nature and humanity in an unresolved state. He doesn't answer the question, which is probably the right answer. But so yeah, I agree. The other thing I would say is that there's some Mahler in the new show. There's always a bit of Mahler somewhere in my shows. I love Mahler. And he was once asked, what are you trying to say in your symphonies? And he said, if I could have said it, I wouldn't have written the music. So language is music is a different language. And sometimes it approaches the same questions.
That's beautifully said. I have one last question is that, we're all talking about artificial intelligence, which is something that you've talked about. And I just wonder when I'm looking at somebody like you and I hear somebody like you, and I've seen so many clips and videos and I've seen you live. I don't think you would ever worry about artificial intelligence taking your job, right? Couldn't do that, right? Could artificial intelligence have that sense of wonder? I don't think so.
I don't know. I mean, I chaired a panel. I don't know a lot about this, but I chaired a panel discussion at the Francis Crick Institute in London with experts. And, there's argument between experts about are we close to these things being artificial general intelligence, which is the language, the jargon for something like us, or are they just these large language models that are glorified search engines or something like that? So I think there's immense potential there. And they will, these models are, as many people will know who use them, increasing productivity. The serious point is that they are a revolution, I think, on the scale of the Industrial Revolution. They will be. There will be, to your point, jobs that become obsolete, the human jobs, the humans do that become obsolete. But there will be new jobs created as well. And so I think that the challenge, as far as I see it, and as far as I gleaned from these discussions with experts, is can we manage this revolution better than we have managed revolutions in the past, which cause social change because they change the nature of the workplace and so on. And, historically, we've been very bad at this, but we do have experience now. So I think the challenge for policymakers is to notice that our societies will change, whether or not these tools are considered to be intelligences of their own accord or whatever. It is certainly true that they're changing the way that we work. And so I think there's a serious answer to your question, which is that I don't know. I don't know. I don't know enough to make a judgment on what these things, what artificial intelligence systems and the large language models actually are. And the reason it goes back to your previous question, actually, just to say, what is a scientist and this idea that we don't know things? I think one of the things that a scientific training gives you is that you understand, you get it when you don't know something, and it should restrain you from just guessing then. And it also gives you a respect for experts in different fields. Because you say, well, they might not be right, but they know more than me. And if they know more than me, they deserve to be listened to in some respect. And so I think that's really crucial. It's probably one of the main reasons why I think that we need to teach science properly in schools. It is not because, which goes back to your first question, it's not because everybody needs to know how old the universe is or how many of the galaxies there are. It doesn't really matter. None of that matters. But I think it ultimately teaches you humility and teaches you how to recognize when you're out your depths, right? You're saying things that you don't have any basis to say. At its best, that's what science is. It teaches you not to do that.
But I think that's a beautiful note to end on, Professor Brian Cox. I think that really is the key. I think as humans, I think we have to rediscover a little bit a sense of humility. That's what I feel. But thank you for this incredibly enlightening conversation. It's an absolute privilege. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming on to In Your Opinion. I'm Rohit Brijnath. You can email me your thoughts on this discussion. My address is in the show notes. You can also find Professor Brian Cox's book recommendations and links to my columns in the show notes. This episode was edited by Haju Rahim and Teo Tongkai. Thank you for being with us.